Just a reminder, everyone, your midterm exam is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Those of you online, can you hear me pretty clearly? Yeah, Eric, is it muffled?
Right, yeah, it's kind of muffled, but I have a question.
Okay.
So basically on our midterm, I know it's 4 questions, so it's basically 4 pages. So you said that when, um, say for example, like we go online and like we search up this article and we read over it, are you gonna do you want the question in particular? Like, do you want us to write down the question? Well, I know I didn't write down the question, but I'm saying like at the end of each question or each page, are we supposed to put like a citation of the?
That would be ideal. Also, if you cite directly from the source, cite within the question as well.
The site is in the question?
So if you're answering the question, right, and you're taking the information directly from the source, you need to cite in your answer where you get that information from. Otherwise, you can just put it at the end of the question. That's fine. Okay,
can
so
you repeat that? Can you repeat that one more time? I'm sorry.
Sure, no, that's okay. So the rules of citation are, once you're writing the answer, okay, so let's say you're on question 1. You look up some information relating to question 1 online. If you take information directly from that, like a quote or a chunk of text, you need to cite that source within your answer so I know where you got the information. If it's just generally you use that source but you put it into your own words, then you can just cite the source at the end of your answer.
Okay, like a MLA citation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, cool. All right, it's just 4 questions, right? So it's basically like 4 pages.
Yeah, yeah.
Like 4.5 or 5 maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, yeah, that's the only thing I have because that's due tonight. Yeah, so that's the only thing I had.
Yep, yep.
All right, appreciate it.
Yeah, and you know what, if you forget, it's fine. I mean, as long as you cite what you've used, that's what matters.
Yes, of course. And then yeah, that should be good enough for me to understand.
Yeah. Okay, okay.
I appreciate it.
I'm sorry, did you have a question, Aaron? Okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, that's fine. You didn't have to include the questions. You just, as long as you numbered the questions, it's fine. Yep, that's fine. Number the answers. Yeah. Sure. So, sorry, Eric, did you have another question? Oh, no, sorry.
Oh no, my bad.
Dr. Jorgensen, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, just checking, okay?
Yep.
Really.
Did you have a question, Johnny, or? You can pop back on if she wants. Midterms are always confusing for students. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Oh, good Lord. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's only to give you guys a week so you can really think about the questions and take your time and answer them. And oh, no, I know. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Understandable. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to finish talking about the governor today. We're going to talk about the various powers the governor has, issues with things, right, the various powers that they have, and then some of the issues we've seen with how our governor has responded to the current COVID crisis. Last time we talked about some of the qualifications, both formal and informal, and now we're going to break down the 5 formal roles and 2 informal roles of the governor. So one of the most important is being the chief executive. Most of the state executive branch is elected independently of the governor. They don't have any particular obligation to the governor to do what he wants, right? Because they're not beholden to him for giving them their position. And if they don't like the governor, they may go out of their way to make his or her job even more difficult. The governor is allowed to appoint the Secretary of State, Commissioner of Education, Commissioners for Insurance and Health and Human Services, Executive Director for the Economic Development and Tourism Board, and the head of the state militia. These are some pretty important positions that the governor is filling, especially Secretary of State, because the Secretary of State is in charge of elections. So Governor Abbott does have some power in this area. He's also allowed to fill a vacancy in the judiciary. They can last quite a while, but basically the rule is if the governor appoints someone in a recess, which is basically when the legislature is not in session, the appointments have to be presented to the Senate within the first 10 days of the next session. And the governor does need a 2/3 majority in the Senate for these various positions. Now, he can remove officials with the consent of the Senate. They can get rid of personal staff members without much difficulty, but they can't get rid of people on a board or commission they didn't appoint. So there's only so much removal power that they have. They're a lot more restricted compared to other states. Right. In terms of the budget, essentially the governor does have to have a good relationship with the legislative branch. So they have to submit a budget message to the legislature within 5 days of the legislature convening. So essentially, he or she needs to let the legislature know, here's what I'm looking for in the budget. Here's what I think is important. Here's what I want to see. It's basically a way of letting the legislature know what the governor's priorities are. They can look at that when they're creating the budget. It's also just kind of a welcome back, goodwill kind of thing as well. Now, the governor doesn't have a lot of budgetary powers. It really does come from the legislature. He can approve emergency funds, but only up to $200,000, which isn't a lot of money. And it's really only if there's an emergency or if an agency runs out of funds. It's pretty rare that they're going to be able to grant an agency emergency funds and that the money will be enough to get them through the next legislative session. Now, where the governor does have some power over the budget is through the federal funding. The federal statutes give the governor the position of being in charge of approving federal grants. So it's up to the governor to use that money to create a new program or policy. For example, post 9/11, the creation of the Homeland Security personnel in the Texas airports. That has to go through the governor, getting the funds, and then setting up 8 branches. So the governor does have some control over the budget when it's coming from the federal government. On something like healthcare, the governor can choose to accept funds or not. Governor Perry chose not to expand Medicaid. Because it was federal funding, he didn't have to go through the legislature for that. He can also try to use some informal tactics to control his administration, using staff members, being willing to compromise, negotiate, being charming, right? Talking to the legislators one-on-one. How's your family? Nice to see you again. Come to the mansion sometime, right? If you can develop a good rapport with the legislature, then you can have more control within your administration. It helps if you can develop a good relationship. Otherwise, you may just be out of luck. So they do need to have people skills. It's not something we consider a lot, but it is something they do need to have. Okay. Any questions online? Another interesting function the governor has is in the area of clemency. Now, the governor can give a one-time 30-day reprieve for someone on death row. Usually they'll do that if there's a chance that their death sentence may have been improperly imposed. So if they want to challenge their execution before the Supreme Court, they may need a temporary reprieve. If new evidence comes to light, you probably don't want to execute someone till you go over that evidence. So if there are circumstances under which a prisoner may have the right not to be executed, the governor can give them 30 days to get things sorted out. The governor can issue pardons, reprieves, and commutations with the consent of the legislature. We don't want the governor deciding to pardon his friends and major donors. We got to make sure they're not abusing their powers with that. The governor can also restore driver's licenses for people who lose it because of DUI or outstanding fines. He can also restore hunting privileges. If someone's caught hunting off season, they can lose their hunting privileges, so he or she can restore that. And, sorry, do you have a question? They can, but it can also be the governor if it's like special circumstances. Yeah. So if someone directly appeals to the governor, he can step in and say, hey guys, you need to restore this person's license or put this person back or whatever it is. Yeah. They can also revoke someone's parole. Like if they're like, you know what, you're clearly not following the guidelines. Again, most of the time this isn't going to be the governor directly saying you can't get parole, but occasionally, for whatever reason, the governor is directly asked and then he might intervene. Usually it's with the Board of Paroles and Pardons, right? If someone isn't meeting with their parole officer, then usually they're the one who will turn them in for a parole violation. So, I mean, there's all these steps so that the governor can't abuse their pardoning power. We had a governor, Miriam Ferguson, who was pardoning people for bribes, and obviously that's not exactly a great idea. So you want to make sure they're not doing things like that. We tend to see the governor getting more involved with the death row process. Like, if there's possible new evidence, issues with the original trial, or the person's trying to file a last-minute appeal with the Supreme Court, that's when we usually see the governor stepping in and going, all right, we'll give you a temporary reprieve. It just depends. The governors can abuse their powers. I used to live in Illinois, and we had a governor, and this one, we had two governors in a row go to jail, but the first one who went to jail, there was a guy who was driving a truck, like a big rig, and he crashed into an SUV and killed a couple of children. It turned out that he never should have been given that license in the first place. But he got it because he'd given a campaign contribution to the governor. So the governor ended up going to jail for that. Because, yeah, obviously you can't have the governor handing out licenses like candy bars and things like that. So not exactly a good thing. Yeah, yeah. And then the governor after him went to jail for trying to sell Obama's Senate seat when he became president. So that was not very smart. Well, and he was dumb enough to get caught an audio recorder. I mean, he really thinks someone's not recording your conversation when you talk about selling the Senate seat? Like, how stupid do you have to be? No, they really don't. They really don't. Just like, oh my God, really. Okay. The governor is also considered a chief legislator. They do have to deliver a message when the legislature opens. So in January of next year, I mean, usually they go into the chamber, but with this COVID, I'm imagining there'll have to be a virtual opening. And probably not a face-to-face session. They may have to set up some kind of virtual session for next year. We won't have a vaccine probably by then. They also have to deliver a message when they retire or lose election. It's kind of a so long and thanks for all the fish kind of thing. Extra credit if you get that joke, I'm kidding. The governor can call the legislature into special session. Now again, these can only last 30 days. But if you don't solve the problem within 30 days, then they can call a special session right after that. And with a special session, they do control the agenda. So if the legislator wants something in the special session, they have to get permission from the governor. Governor Richards She only used a special session twice. Governor Bush never called a special session. Governor Perry, he pretty much abused his power of special session. He called them into special session 3 times in 2013 to deal with redistricting, which is important, abortion, which shouldn't require a special session, and highway programs. So he tended to abuse his special session powers, and that really irritated legislators because they just want to go home. They don't want to be there indefinitely. Really, you shouldn't be holding a special session on the issue of abortion anyway. It's not a state emergency. It just didn't make a lot of sense. The governor can veto legislation. Will do so usually at the end of the session to allow for a potential override, although that's very rare. But vetoes seen as a sign of weakness because you shouldn't have to veto the legislation if you're working directly with the legislatures. If you can't get the legislation you want, then you're not doing your job as governor. You're not compromising or negotiating. So that doesn't necessarily work the way they want it to. And Governor Perry got into some trouble with the line item veto. In 2014, he got indicted by a grand jury in Austin. He threatened to veto a $5.7 million budget for the Travis County Public Integrity Unit. He wanted the DA in Austin to resign due to a DUI. So she refused to resign and he vetoed it, and it was seen as a personal vendetta. And so a grand jury indicted him for that. He didn't end up going to court, but obviously you don't want the governor vetoing legislation because of a personal vendetta. And also they need to be careful with the line item veto, because if they abuse it too much, the state legislature will just start doing some appropriations so they can't veto the education budget, healthcare, etc. All right, any questions, comments online? The governor is also commander-in-chief of the state. He or she is allowed to declare martial law. It's happened a handful of times. In 1931, it was necessary to end a riot in an oil field in East Texas. And it was necessary in 1943 during World War II because there were a lot of African American soldiers stationed along the Gulf Coast, and there was a lot of issues of racism, and it got pretty ugly for a while. So if necessary, the governor can declare martial law and basically take over the state. The governor is also the commander-in-chief of the state military forces. So they're in charge of the Army National Guard and the Air Force National Guard, unless they get called up by the federal government. So the National Guard in Texas is controlled by Governor Abbott, unless President Trump calls them up for federal action. We've seen some of our National Guard members being used along the border for immigration and other issues. The governor can assume command of the Texas Rangers and the Department of Public Safety. Usually this is done if there's some kind of natural disaster, like a hurricane, tornado, something along those lines. Also, if there's issues along the border, they can assume control along the border. They're also in control of the Division of Emergency Management. So right after 9/11, there was a federal Department of Homeland Security that was created. So every state created its own branch of Homeland Security, and the governor controls that. So if there are issues with potential terrorist threats, immigration issues, and so on, then the governor can take charge. We've seen some issues with human trafficking, smuggling of people across the border, drug trafficking, of course the issues with the proposed extension of the border wall. That's gotten really contentious a bit. And the governor does tend to rely on local law enforcement, right? He can't be everywhere, he can't do everything. If he's in Austin, he probably has not much clue what's going on in the Rio Grande Valley. So he's going to rely on the people here to tell him what's going on. He's really only going to step in if it's some kind of statewide emergency. If there's another major hurricane like Hurricane Harvey, another 9/11 type event, a mass shooting, he's going to step in and take control of law enforcement for temporary purposes. Like going to El Paso after the shooting in 2019, things like that. All right, any questions online? Okay, so the governor is also considered the chief of state. He'll do things like going to a Veterans Day parade or doing a coin toss at the Cotton Bowl, kind of ceremonial but good public relations images, especially if the University of Texas or A&M end up in the Cotton Bowl, he will definitely be there. So it's kind of the fluffy role, but it's important for people to see the governor out and about, to see him doing the kind of fluffy, kissing babies, shaking hands, you know, go Texas kind of roles. And we do see the governor using social media. It really does help them have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Because when Governor Abbott tweets something, it does tend to get the attention of the national media. As governor of one of the biggest states, especially a border state, he does tend to get a lot of national press. So he can use social media to promote the image of Texas, like when he negotiated with Tesla to bring a new factory here. He got a lot of press, good and bad. When he talks about COVID, border security, and so on, there tends to be national press there. He does get a lot more attention compared to other governors. He does enjoy a pretty big national press, and he has to be able to sell that. So he does take on the role of a chief salesperson, trying to promote Texas business. Governor Richards, she went to the U.S. Senate asking them to ratify NAFTA because of the expansion to Texas-Mexico trade, right? She saw it as beneficial to Texas because we could open factories on the Mexican side of the border that were American. Downside, of course, was businesses then went to Mexico and took manufacturing jobs with them. But the idea at the time was we'd have more cross-border trade, which we have. And Governor Perry went to New York and Italy to promote the benefits of moving your business to Texas. And it has paid out. We have seen more companies moving to Texas because of no state income tax, low business tax, and fairly low wages across the board. So Tesla is moving here. Companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, and others all see Texas as a great place to do business because the cost of doing business is much cheaper than California, New York, etc. Right, the governor is also essentially a diplomat. The governor does have to work with the federal government on funding, right? We need money for X, Y, Z. Okay, well, it has to come from Congress. If the governor wants more money for education, he has to talk to Congress about it and the Department of Education. He also has to work with the government on regulations. New regulations that come in on things like worker safety, the environment, labor laws, and so on, the governor has to implement. So the governor has to work with Congress, has to work with the White House, and has to work with the courts on various laws, regulations, and so on. So he is our point of contact with the federal government. He's also going to work with other states on issues like water distribution. With the Rio Grande River flowing across the border, we have to deal with that. Shared water sources like lakes and rivers, we have to negotiate with New Mexico or Oklahoma or Louisiana. Also, when there was that oil spill off the Gulf of Mexico in 2010, Texas did get hit kind of hard on the Gulf Coast because of tourism. So we were working with Louisiana, Alabama, and other states to try and get it cleaned up as quickly as possible. If a hurricane hits Louisiana and Texas, we're going to be talking to Louisiana about how to handle it. Also, issues like transportation, setting up cross-state trains, transportation of goods out of Texas, and so on. And we do have, the governor has an interesting role that a lot of governors don't. He does have international relations status. A lot of governors, their negotiating skills are limited to other states. Our governor gets to work on an international level, create social and economic exchanges, NAFTA, creating highways for transporting goods across the border, businesses that are run by both countries, and so on, right? So the governor actually has the ability to engage in international diplomacy. That's pretty rare. There's only a handful of governors who can do so. So he can set up cultural exchange programs, education visas so Mexican students can go to American high schools and colleges, diplomatic ties. He has a lot more power compared to other governors, so he does need to be able to negotiate, have a good relationship with Mexico, because the last thing we need is Mexico deciding to retaliate against Texas for doing something somewhat stupid. So, and obviously they have to deal with issues like immigration, the presence of cartels. It's not as bad here compared to other states, but we still have to deal with human trafficking especially. The governor is also involved in things like the National Governors Association, opening up discussions with other states, talking to the governors of neighboring states like Oklahoma, New Mexico, and others, trying to set up a relationship, open a business here. We'll talk about negotiating a trade deal between our two states, agricultural deals, transportation, etc. And they also have to sign the rendition papers to send a fugitive back to the state they committed the crime. If someone robs a bank in New Mexico and flees to Texas, the governor has to send them back to New Mexico. They'll also have to work with the federal government if it's something like a multi-state incident. If you have a serial killer who's killing people in Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, etc., usually that's federal, but they still have to figure out when we would get a crack at that person, how they go on trial, and so on. They do have to do a lot of work on the state level, the national, and even the international level. They need to be good at compromising, negotiating, and willing to work with other people. All right, so one of the more informal roles is to be the chief of party. They are the head of their party on the state level. Governor Abbott is the head of the Texas Republican Party. So they're the key speaker at the state convention. They're the last person to speak, or the biggest speaker. And they do lead their party's delegation to the national convention. Now, obviously, this year that didn't happen because we couldn't have a national Republican or Democratic convention. But if we did have a convention, Governor Abbott would have been the lead delegate for the Texas delegation at the Republican National Convention. And in all likelihood, he would have been one of the speakers at the convention as well. And he or she does have an influence on the candidates running for state office. If you can get the endorsement of the governor, you're gold, right? I mean, if the governor is like, I endorse this person to run for office, and he's got a pretty damn good chance of not only getting the nomination, but winning. On the other hand, if the governor is like, this person is awful, they suck, then you're probably not going to get very far. If the governor asks someone to run for office, it's kind of hard to say no to that. And sometimes the governor has to push back a little bit on the on his party. With Governor Bush, he was willing to work with the Democrats in the state legislature. And then in 1996, the party didn't want to include Senator Dave Bailey Hutchinson in their delegation to the National Committee Convention because of her stance on abortion. And he said to them, she is a member of your party, she's going, get over it. So he was willing to argue with the party establishment and say, no, you do have to put up with the fact that she's going. She's a member of your party, she represents the state nationally, you have to deal with it. Governor Perry, on the other hand, just wasn't very good at negotiating. He tended to take a stance of my way or the highway. So he would constantly fight with the Speaker of the House, who was more moderate, And then, it just wasn't very cordial. He tended to be more conservative than his party was at the time. Now, Governor Abbott is better at negotiating, but his lieutenant governor is more conservative, and the former Speaker of the House was more moderate. The lieutenant governor would say, I want this on the agenda, and the Speaker would say, it's not something we need to deal with right now. They would argue about things like the issue of transgender bathroom rights. And the Speaker of the House would say, look, this isn't something super critical we need to deal with. And the Lieutenant Governor would say, it absolutely is. And so they'd go back and forth and back and forth. Moderate was replaced with a conservative speaker, but then he had to step down recently because of some kind of allegation. There's no current Speaker of the House. Sometimes they do have to fight with their own party. And sometimes they have to push the party to do the right thing. And sometimes they have to negotiate between the factions in their party when they aren't willing to talk to each other. So Governor Bush was pretty good at it. Governor Perry was terrible at it. Governor Abbott's pretty decent. It does help that he has a Republican majority in the State House and the State Senate. If that changes after this election, we'll have to see how he deals with that. It's easy to get things done when your party controls all of the state bodies. So the other informal role, but still important role, is leader of the people. Even though our governor is constitutionally weak, we do look to him or her to solve our problems. With COVID, we're all looking at the governor and going, what do we do? Do we shut down? Do we reopen? What are the rules here? And the governor can use the media to get public support. He can or she can hold a press conference, can do a photo op, a campaign rally, some kind of use of the media to get the public to support more funding for law enforcement, for new education policies. And it helps when the governor does show up. When the governor comes to a natural disaster area and talks to people and says, how are you doing? How can we help you? It looks good, right? It shows sympathy and concern. And it makes people feel a little bit better because they know that someone's paying attention to them. So it helps to have the governor showing up and talking to people after a hurricane, a tornado, a shooting. It just looks good to have the governor showing up and talking to people. So the governor does need to have leadership skills. The better they are at negotiating, the better they are at being a clear leader, the more likely they are to get what they want. So they have to be good at their jobs if they ever want to get anything done. And of course, they do try to reflect the values of Texas citizens and voters. Recently, Texas has been a bit more conservative. That may change because we are going to become a, what they call minority majority state. The governor may change some of his stance on some issues. He or she may not be as conservative going forward, especially if this does become a swing state. If by some weird happenstance Joe Biden wins Texas in this election, the governor's going to be taking a good long look at this and going, I don't know if I can win re-election, and he may have to kind of move more towards the middle at that point. Because Texas is up in the air in this election for the first time in half a century. So it could have some very interesting ramifications for Governor Abbott if somehow Joe Biden wins Texas. It's not guaranteed, but it would be quite the shock if somehow that happened. Okay, any questions online on this? Okay, so since we have a little time for discussion, obviously one of the biggest problems we're seeing right now with the governor is the response to COVID. I'm going to be completely blunt here, and I'm going to say he could have done a much better job of handling the situation. There was no perfect response to a global pandemic. No state got it 100% right. But I do think our governor took kind of the wrong approach to dealing with the problem. So I'm curious to see, what do you guys think about the governor's handling of the COVID crisis? What are your thoughts on this? It sucks. Okay, yeah, that's pretty succinct. It sucks. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, that's fair.
In reality, people come up with a vaccine for basically most disease viruses. Ebola. That one became a crisis here in the United States. They began developing into it, and then they had to after when it comes to COVID, they're taking this time with it, and then they have these new laws. You have to wear a mask everywhere, and you have to keep quarantining at home. They should be able to have like some way to be successful to be able to take a vaccine.
Yeah.
That even living this for almost the whole year and yet still.
Yeah. Now, the one thing I will say about the Ebola crisis was that Ebola had been around for a lot longer. It wasn't a new virus like this one. And part of the reason a vaccine was finally developed was because it killed 11,000 people in West Africa. So there's finally a push to actually develop a vaccine. There were a couple of cases, but it was very, very, very low compared to COVID. We're talking maybe, I say no more than 10 cases in the United States of Ebola. Yeah, I mean, you do raise a good point, right? They were able to come up with a vaccine. And they were testing the vaccine when there was that mass outbreak in West Africa. But yeah, it killed like 11,000 people in West Africa. And that's when they finally were able to develop the vaccine. I know they are working on one in the UK, France, Germany. Russia is trying one out, but I don't trust Russian vaccine protocols because I don't know what they're doing over there. There's a Johnson & Johnson is doing testing in the US. They've hit a snag where one of the volunteers became ill, and they don't know if it's related to the vaccine or not, so they had to suspend human trials. So they are working on it, but no one's gotten through the human trial stage yet. It has to clear the human trial stage before they can clear it for mass release. So they are working on it. It's just trying to figure out which version of the vaccine will work, what has the least amount of side effects, and how quickly we can get it out to people. Yeah, I mean, it is frustrating because it's like, it's been almost a year and nobody seems to know what the hell to do, and there's a second wave that's been hitting Europe. Are we going to hit again? Do we reopen everything? It's unclear. Yeah, it's complicated. I agree with that. It's been right.
the classes and everything.
Yeah. Yeah, that's problematic. I mean, on the one hand, if they do live together, you do want to try to protect them. On the other hand, if she tests negative, then it might actually be better if she's not there, because then, yeah, right, what happens if you're quarantining with someone who has the disease but you don't? Yeah, it's tricky. It's definitely tricky. Yeah, that's understandable. That's completely understandable, yeah. You don't, if they're not positive, I can see both sides of it. So on the one hand, you may test negative for now, right? But what if she shows symptoms later? On the other hand, if she tested negative, maybe she shouldn't be there so that she doesn't pick up the virus, right? It's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. You might have it, you might not. Yeah, it's complicated. My older sister had to get tested in July, and it was tricky because my parents were coming down here to help me move apartments, and they're like, on the one hand, you know, we live in the same house with her, so is it safe to come down? On the other hand, we're not showing any symptoms. And so they came down anyway, and she tested negative. But it's like, how do you deal with the balance of you have things you have to do, but if someone in your household has it, can you actually still do anything, right? Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky, to say the least. My little sister lives in California, and her workplace, they've been working from home since March, and they've pretty much told everyone that they're probably not coming back into the office before the end of the year, if that. Pretty much everyone wasn't laid off is working from home. So, yeah. All right, what about you guys online? What do you think of what's happening here in Texas with COVID and everything? You can use the chat function if that's easier. You can take a minute to type in the question. Okay, no one online comment? Okay. I'm taking the diplomatic response of no comment. Okay. So the exam is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. in Blackboard. You do have 2 attempts to upload the exam, so if you're like, oh, I forgot to cite something, or oops, this is the wrong draft, you can resubmit your exam. It does go through Safe Assign, just as a safety check. You can see your score. Most of it's usually coincidental, correct, that isn't plagiarism, but it's a way to make sure you didn't just buy an exam online and try to pass it off as your own. Not that you guys would do that, but just in case. Yeah. Yeah, and only if you, yeah, well, you do pay attention, so, yeah. Okay, so if for some reason Blackboard is not working tonight, you can email me the exam, but try to upload it into Blackboard. We will move on to Chapter 8 on Monday. So, first half of Chapter 8 for Monday. If you have any questions over the weekend, feel free to email me, call, or text me. And the benefit of turning in your exam through Blackboard is once I've graded your exam, you'll be able to see your grade, so you're not going to be waiting forever to find out how you did. Yeah. People tend to do pretty well. They tend to do pretty well. And that's it for today. There's something else I was going to say, and I totally lost my train of thought. Oh well. Okay, so I'll see some of you in class on Monday and some of you online. Enjoy your weekend, stay safe, and yeah, just make sure I get your exam tonight.